Okay, so now let's talk about markets. So perfectly competitive markets. This is again a really important concept in Eco. So first of all, what's a market? It's a place where buyers and sellers just come along, they meet to perform a transaction. So they exchange goods and services pretty much. So for example, Queen Victoria Market, obviously if you go to a bookshop, that's another type of market. And a perfectly competitive market is a very important structure that we learn for Unit 3 for Eco. So, are they in the study design? Obviously, you're going to have to look at that, but it's really important to know how a perfectly competitive market works and the properties of a perfectly competitive market. So, let's talk about that. So, in a perfectly competitive market, there are many buyers and many sellers. So, lots and lots of buyers, lots and lots of sellers. We assume that the buyers and sellers act rationally. So, the aim of the buyers is to maximize their satisfaction, so maximize their happiness with the product that they purchase. And the aim of the sellers is to maximize their profit. So, literally, to make as much money as possible. And then finally, we assume that they have perfect market knowledge. So this is called full information. So this literally means that when a buyer and seller enter the market, they both have the same information and they're fully knowledgeable about the good that's being sold. So for example, in real life, if someone is selling you a car or a second-hand car, to be honest, you're not perfectly knowledgeable. They can lie to you about it being in good condition. They can lie to you about it never having an accident. But in a perfectly competitive market, both parties know exactly everything there is to know about the product. The products are homogeneous, so that literally means that they're identical. So there's nothing distinguishing the products except price. So when you step into the market, the only thing that's distinguishing each product is the price of the product. So for example, there's no advertising, there's no labeling and branding and all of that. Homogeneous literally means products are indistinguishable except for price. There's little to no barriers to entry and exit. So what that means is anyone can become a seller, anyone can become a buyer. There's no licenses or permits or costs associated with setting up. So it's no barriers to entry and exit. So what does this mean for our market? It means that, we want to make sure that we sell at the lowest prices possible and buy at the lowest prices possible. So sellers want to sell at a high price, buyers want to buy at a low price, and sellers are price takers because price is the only thing distinguishing the products. That's it. And one more thing, so there's little to no government intervention. So there's no taxes, there's no subsidies, it's just the market works by itself. So demand is a really important factor. So obviously there needs to be demand in a market for it to work. So the law of demand is a really important concept, and it really tells us how willing and able a consumer is to buy a type of product at a certain price. So as your price goes up, the quantity demanded also goes down. So it's inversely related. So this is the law of demand here, by the way. So these two sentences. So as the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. Which makes sense. So if something is being more expensive, you're going to be less willing to buy it. And as something becomes cheaper, you're going to be more willing to buy it. And that applies to pretty much everyone. And why does that happen? Well, there's quite a few effects. So first is the income effect. So as your price increases, people aren't able to afford it as much. So that's the income effect. So only the rich people would buy it as the price becomes too high. Perceived utility. So next, is it really worth that much? So like I said earlier with the bubble tea example, we assign a worth to each product that we're gonna buy. And we have to think about whether it's worth that much. So for example, let's say I assigned a value of $10 for the mango bubble tea earlier. If a toucher decided to price the mango bubble tea for $10, I would buy it. But if the pearl milk tea was $10, I probably won't. That's more than what I value it for. So that's perceived utility. So is it worth that much? So as the price increases, people start to wonder if it's really worth that much anymore. Next, diminishing marginal utility. So diminishing marginal utility is about whether you think it's still, so it's about how many you buy, for example. So for example, let's say we have ice creams on a summer day, right? If you eat one, you're really happy, you really enjoy it. But the more you eat, the less satisfaction you get it from it. So the more you eat, you might start feeling sick, you might start feeling like you don't really like ice cream anymore. So that's pretty much the concept here. So diminishing marginal utility is the more you buy, the less satisfaction you start to get. So that's why even if price increases, you start to have less satisfaction. Substitution effect. So this is another important concept. So this, for example, this is basically when, as the price of a product increases, you start to look for other substitutes. So for example, egg prices are getting really high, right? So what people might do is they might be like, well, egg prices are really high, but chicken prices are actually kind of low. So they might look for the substitutes instead. Okay, so now let's talk about the law of supply. Oh, I want to highlight one more thing. So this curve is downward sloping. So as the price increases, quantity demanded is really low. As the price decreases, quantity demanded is really high. Okay, next is supply. And supply is all about how willing and able suppliers are to supply a good or service at different prices. So this is the law of supply here. So as the price increases, the quantity supplied also increases, and as the price goes down, the quantity supplied also goes down. So it pretty much says that they are directly proportional. So a higher price means that suppliers want to produce more. And why is that? It's all about profits. So they want to make profits. So if prices are high, so if the selling price is high, there's a greater margin of profit. Whereas if the selling price is low, there's a lower margin of profit. Here is the supply curve. So it's upward sloping. So a low price means that there's a low quantity sold, and a high price means that there's a high quantity sold. Okay, so now let's discuss the markets and government intervention. So when we talk about a market, it's pretty much demand and supply working together. So here is an example of a great demand and supply curve. And this point labeled E here is called the equilibrium. So the equilibrium is literally the point where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded, and the market is, there's literally no shortage, no surplus. So shortage, too little produced, so demand is more than supply, and surplus is too much produced, demand less than supply. So we want to make sure demand and supply are equal. We'll talk about graphing and everything later on as well. So a little bit about demand and supply graphs. So shortages, If there is a shortage, it means that suppliers see an opportunity to get more money. So shortage usually means that prices go up. They can raise the price as well because of that shortage. If there's a surplus, suppliers want to get rid of the extra stock, so the extra stock that they have, and they actually just lower the price instead. Okay, so graphing. So we need to really be mindful of the difference between a movement in the demand and supply curve and a shift in the demand and supply curve. So a shift happens if something other than the price of that product changes. So this is called a microeconomic factor of demand or supply. So it's just a fancy word of saying it. So for example here, demand curve has shifted right, which means that at any given price, there is more demand. And we can say it's also increased or decreased. So here, here it's decreased. So demand has shifted left, meaning that there is less demand at any given price. Okay, let me go back. All right, so this is pretty much a summary of shifts and movements. Just remember, movements are because of price-related factors. So it's literally the price of that specific good or service changing, whereas shift is all about other non-price related factors. So this is an example of a SAC or exam question. So let's say there's strong economic activity through HLN, and that results in more income. So if there are more incomes, remember, more incomes means that more people are able to afford ice cream. So demand shifts right. So at any given price of ice cream, more people are willing and able to buy it. Next, at the old equilibrium price, so you can see the dotted line extended, there is a shortage. So supply is here, demand is here, there's a shortage. So suppliers decide to raise their prices. So to up here, to P2, to counteract that shortage and make more profits. So this results in a new equilibrium at a greater price and a higher quantity sold. So that's pretty much what happens in the ice cream market. So this is another one to think about. So milk prices. Milk becomes cheaper. And how would that affect ice cream market? So remember, milk, you need milk to produce ice cream. So if milk is cheaper to buy, it probably is cheaper to make ice cream as well. Ooh. So that means, I should also draw the graph. That means supply shifts right here. Okay, at the old price, there is a surplus. So I should label this as supply 2. Okay, so there's a surplus at the old price. This means that because of the surplus, suppliers lower their prices to clear their stock. This results in a new quantity supplied. Oh, terrible writing here. And at a lower price. There we go. There we go. All right, so that's it. So that's how this would affect the ice cream market. So at the end of the day, there will be more ice cream sold, but at a lower price. Okay, so now let's talk about market failure. So market failure is all about how markets might not allocate resources in a way that maximizes society's living standards. So things don't always go to plan in a free market, and that gives us market failure. So this is pretty much when the market fails to allocate resources in a way that maximizes living standards. So simple as that, that is the definition of market failure. So there's quite a few market failures to think about. So externalities, public goods, common access resources, asymmetric info, and government failure. So let's start with externalities. So when we make a transaction, the person demanding the good or service and the supplier, they're not the only ones that are affected. So there can also be third parties, so people not involved in the transaction who are also affected by the transaction. So for example, let's talk about cigarettes and alcohol. Whoops. So when someone goes into the shop and they buy cigarettes, there's a transaction between the person buying those cigarettes and the person who's selling them. Okay, cool. But what there is, we don't really see as much, is there's also a cost on society when someone buys cigarettes. So for example, the person smoking, they're gonna affect the air around them. They're gonna affect the people near them because of passive smoking, the smell of cigarette smoke in the air, and all of that. Maybe littering of like this, the used cigarettes, so the cigarette butts, and so on. So those are negative externalities. So they are third-party costs of consuming or producing a certain good or service. So in the example of cigarettes, consuming cigarettes can lead to these third-party costs. Alcohol, similar example. So consuming alcohol can have third-party costs as well. For example, if people drink too much alcohol and they get extremely drunk, they can turn violent, they have less self-control, and so on. So that can actually put others in society at risk. So it's important to recognize the external costs. So it's not just the cost that someone pays when they buy that product, it's also the extra cost that society as a whole pays as a result of consuming or producing that product. So this is called the social cost. So social cost is the external social cost that people pay in addition to the private cost. So people don't often realize the social cost of their actions, and that results in overproduction of negative externalities. So here, when people consume cigarettes and alcohol, they don't really realize that the social cost is greater than the private cost, so the actual physical cost of the products. So this means that we're not at the socially optimal equilibrium. So this means that we're not maximizing society's living standards as a whole. Okay, so that's pretty much a little funny thing here. But let's do an example. So now let's talk about externalities in production. So there's a river, and the car factories are dumping toxic waste in there, and that's damaging crops, right? So that is actually a negative externality in production. So first of all, this car factory is not realizing the effect it's having on the crops in elasticity. So that's something to consider. So they're not considering the third-party cost. Another thing, toxic waste means that people might die. It's harmful to people to drink water contaminated with their toxic waste. So again, another negative effect. So those are just stuff that need to be considered. So for example, let's look at this. So there's a car market in scarcity, right? It's here. It's at equilibrium. But if people realize the social cost of consuming these cars from these car factories, the demand might actually be lower. There might actually be less cars produced in the end. So the problem with a free market is the failure to realize those social costs. So if we have the government of ATAL land, they might actually give a tax on car producers in scarcity just because they dump the water, they dump into the river. So this is government intervention. And this tax helps internalize the social cost. So it helps realize what the social cost is, and it really puts the price of that social cost. Another way the government could fix this issue, there's quite a few ways. So there's taxes one. Another one is just bans. So just like concrete bans on not producing here. They might put limits on how many cars they produce and so on. Okay, so common access resources. This is another type of externality. So, one more externality I want to mention is positive externalities. So positive externalities are goods and services that have positive effects in production. So they have positive social effects. So for example, vaccination is one, education is one as well. So people often don't realize the social benefit. So for vaccination, when people get vaccinated, there's herd immunity. One person getting vaccinated means that less risk of disease for the whole society. So that's just an example. Okay, so now let's go to common access resources. So this is related to sustainability. And key points about common access resources. First, they're rivalrous, meaning that when one person consumes them, another person consuming them is impacted. And they're non-excludable. So just because one person is non-excludable means that you can't exclude anyone from consuming these goods or services. So, market equilibrium, the quantity traded is too high. We're not at social equilibrium because these are often overused and they're not managed very well. So an example of a common access resource is like land resource. So for example, fishing, the fish in the ocean. That's a common access resource because one, it's rivalrous. So if I go fish and I overfish, it means that someone else fishing from that same ocean might have less access to fish. Next is non-excludable because, there's a huge ocean. It's not like someone can own it. It's not like someone can own it and say, well, you're not allowed to fish here, you can't fish here. So that's an example. How does the government react? They might put limits. So for example, in terms of fishing, they might say, well, you can't catch fish that are smaller than this size. You can't catch more than this many fish in one day. So putting those limits might help sustain those common access resources. Asymmetric info. So this is pretty much about both parties having perfect market knowledge, so perfect information. But in the real world, this is not always the case. So for example, perfect market knowledge in terms of like buying a car. So when you have a mechanic telling you what repairs you need on a car, you don't know if they're telling you the truth or if they're lying to you to just scam you. So this is where economic agents don't know as much as everyone else. Another example, global financial crises. So again, it's about mortgages, banks not knowing whether people can afford it or not. Okay, the way that governments can intervene, they can put taxes on stuff. So this is especially relevant to externalities. They can subsidize goods with positive externalities. There's quotas. So then, for example, overfishing. They might be like only a certain number of fish you can catch every day. Or for negative externalities, only a certain amount of these goods can be produced. Bans. So just being like total bans. So saying consumption of this good or service is illegal. So for example, illicit drugs are completely banned because of the negative externalities they pose to society. And other things they can do, obviously, permits, making sure that people get a permit, or creating a barrier to entry, so just making it more difficult for people to engage in a certain activity and so on. Okay, so let's say there is a subsidy. So let's say the government subsidizes a certain good or service. Oh, I should probably draw this then. I thought I already drew them. Okay, so government subsidizes. This makes it cheaper to produce that good, lowers production costs, makes suppliers more willing and able to supply. So supply 2. Creates a surplus, price is lowered, and then lower priced, higher quantity. So the purpose of this is to make these goods with positive externalities more accessible to society by making them lower price and a higher quantity sold. Quota. If there's a quota, if the government says there is a limit on how much you can supply, so if the government says, hey, there's a limit now on how much you can supply, that pretty much says that, well, you're not allowed to supply as much. So supply has to shift left at all given prices. So less supply at any given price because there's a quota. So suppliers just cannot produce as much. Shortage. So this leads to higher price sold at a lower quantity. So you're trying to reduce the production of that. And that's it.